Hey, what's up everybody? Today we're going to be talking about the array prototype methods. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the filter method. So what the array prototype is basically anytime you create an array in a JavaScript project, it automatically inherits a bunch of features of the array prototype. So there is a long list of class methods that you can apply to your arrays. And those are all listed here on this sidebar. You can see there's a whole host of prototype methods available for arrays, but like I said, today we're going to be talking about the filter method. The filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by the provided function. So basically what that means is that you apply the filter method to an array in your project, and what you're trying to do is return a modified version of that array, and the way that you do that is by providing your own criteria in your filter method that dictates what gets included in the new updated array and what gets discarded. So in the example here, they have a words array and they invoke the filter method on that words array, and it gives them this callback function here. And if we go into the documentation here, the parameters of the filter method, the first parameter of the filter method is a callback function. And that's what we saw here. This is the callback function. And then the next thing that they talk about here is the arguments that get accepted by that callback function specifically. So the callback function in the filter method accepts an element as its first argument, which means the element that is currently being processed in the array. The second argument is the index, meaning the index of the current element being processed in the array. And that's going to come in handy later on. The third is the array that filter was called upon. And then the second argument of the filter method outside of the callback is this arg, the value to use as this when executing the callback. And this is a can of worms on its own. We'll go over that in another video. So if you look at this example that they use, word is the current element being processed in the array. And right now, word represents spray. That's the first element to be processed in the array, so to speak. It's going to check if the length of that current word, which is going to be spray right now, is greater than 6. This is the criteria that an element needs to meet to be included in the new array that gets returned. So once it checks that first element for whether or not it meets that criteria, it decides to discard the element or add it to the new array. In this one, the length of spray is not greater than 6 because it has less than 6 characters. So then we move on to the next element, which is the word limit, which also is less than 6 characters, so it also gets discarded. And then we move on to elite, which is also less than 6 characters. And then here we get to exuberant, which is greater than 6 characters. So it is our first element that meets the criteria of this filter method, and it gets added to our new updated array, along with the following 2 elements because they are also greater than 6 characters. So then we get this new array of only elements that are longer than 6 characters. So now we're going to apply the filter method to a real world project. And what I used is I basically recreated the to-do list that I made in my first video. And the only difference is that this list specifies that you're adding names to the list, whereas before it was to-do items. This is the same exact logic, the same exact structure, the same exact functionality. In fact, I used the filter method in the video that I created for that to-do list, but I didn't really go over the concept. And so I decided to break down that concept in a separate video. So what we have here is a project that is operational as far as adding items to it. So I can add names to my list. And each of these items has its own delete button, but you can see that the delete button does nothing. I haven't applied any functionality to it yet, and I'm going to do that using the filter method. So as you can see, our delete button currently has no onClick added to it. We're going to fix that right now. So we're going to say const handle delete equals, and this is actually going to take in a name, because if we look down here, we're actually going through the name list array with this other array prototype method called map, which I can go over in another video. But all we need to know is that we're iterating over this array already, and the only thing that we're doing currently with that array is iterating over every element and rendering each element so that the user sees each element in the array. But now what we're going to do is pass a name to this handle delete function, and use information that we have about this name to compare it to each item on the name list array. And then we're going to write some criteria for whether or not to include it in the updated array. And we don't want to include it because we're using this to delete items off of a list. So we'll take in a name in this handle delete. And then if you look at this example in the documentation, they run words.filter and then they store its result inside of a variable. That's actually what we're going to do, because when we get our new updated list, we have to invoke setNameList and pass the updated array without that item on it to setNameList so that the user can see the updated version of the array without the item that they just deleted. So we're going to create that variable right now, and we're going to name it updated names. And so we'll say the value of updated names is the result of invoking the filter method on the namelist array and then giving it the criteria that we want to give it. So what we'll do is say namelist.filter, and then remember the first argument is going to be the current element being processed in the array. So we're going to name that argument current name. And then remember the second argument that this callback function accepts is the index of that item. So we're going to pass index to it. This wasn't used in the example, but I need it for the example that we're going to be using. So now we're going to provide the criteria for being included in the array that this filter method returns. And the way that we're going to do that is to say the index of whatever we're iterating over, whatever is currently being processed, as long as it doesn't match the index of the name that we pass to this function, then it meets the criteria to be included in the updated array. So that's what we're going to be referencing is the index. And that's how we are going to instruct this project to say, hey, whatever I just clicked delete on, give me an updated array without that element in it. And there actually happens to be another array prototype method called indexOf, and you pass a value to indexOf, and all that it does is return the index of that value. So as long as that value exists on the array, it'll return the index. And if it doesn't, I believe it returns -1. Right, so the definition says the indexOf method returns the first index at which a given element can be found in the array, or -1 if it is not present. So if the value doesn't exist on the array, then the indexOf method just returns -1. Otherwise, it'll find the location of that element. In this example, they look for the index of bison. So they invoke indexOf on beasts and say beasts.indexOf bison. So look for this value, a string that says bison, on the beasts array, and then tell me what index you found it at. And since we know that arrays use a zero-based index, this element here is located in index number 1 because ant is index 0. So now what we can do is use that indexOf to compare a couple of elements and modify our array. So the criteria for being included in the updated array is namelist.indexOf current name has to not equal namelist.indexOf name. So we're taking this name, and what this name is, again, is we're iterating through the name list, and then name is going to be whatever you click delete on. So for every time a name gets rendered, a new delete button gets rendered with it. And when you click the delete button on that name gets passed to this handle delete function. And then we iterate through the namelist array. And when we invoke that function, the filter function on the namelist array, for the current element being processed in that array, we compare its index to the index of the name that we just passed to the filter method. And if those two indexes match, then it did not meet the criteria for being included in the new array. Now we need to make it so that the UI reflects those changes so that the user can see that the item is no longer on the list. And the way that we do that is we take this value that we stored the result of the filter method in, we invoke setNameList, and we set namelist to updated names. So that is all the logic that we need to remove an item from a list and to make it so that the list is rendered as a view on the front end. Now the only thing left to do is to add that function as an on-click to our delete button. But there's a catch. we can say onClick. And what we're going to do here is invoke an inline function so that we can pass an event to that function. And that way we can invoke event.preventDefault, because if we don't, the default functionality of a button's onClick function is to refresh the page, and we don't want to refresh the page. We just want to update the list view. So we'll invoke this inline function, and we'll say that it takes in an event, and then we'll say event.preventDefault. And then underneath that, we invoke handle delete, and then we pass our current name to that function. So if we save that, it should enable us to delete items off of this list. And there we go. I click delete, it deletes the item that I'm trying to delete. So that's a real world practical application of the filter method that you would use in a real project. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I encourage you guys to go through and read this documentation. I'm going to provide the links for the documentation for the filter method and for index of. I encourage you guys to go through and read that on your own, because reading documentation is an extremely important aspect of learning programming, especially if you're learning it on your own. If you're reading other people's code and they're using something that already exists in JavaScript, you need to be able to go through the documentation and understand those concepts just by reading about them on your own. And this is the place to do it, is in the documentation. So I encourage you to read those, and I encourage you to create your own projects where you implement this onto arrays of whatever information you want to display on the front end. And if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments. But thanks for watching, and happy coding.